The relationship between television and the war was a new one, because when we have had wars in the past, we didn't have television. Our last real war, big war, was World War II. And what we had then were theater newsreels, so-called newsreels. They were reels, not news. And Life magazine. And what they put on the screen and put in the magazine was whatever the armed services handed them, because we had total censorship in World War II. And one manifestation of that many people may not remember is that until almost the end of the war, no American body, soldier's body, serviceman's body, ever appeared in any news media, because they weren't allowed to. There were pictures of Germans and Japanese, but no Americans, because they were trying to maintain the classic fiction that war is a great heroic enterprise, and did not want people to feel or to know that it is in fact bloody, muddy, brutal, wasteful, extravagant, expensive, disorganized, confused. So we had total censorship, and it came out that that World War II was somewhat like the military ceremony at halftime at a pro football game, all glittering trombones and flapping flags and clean uniforms and so on, because everything else was censored out. In the Vietnamese War, there was no censorship, and so for the first time, the American people had some idea of what a war really is like. And for the first time, the American people turned against it. They turned against it for the first time because they had seen it for the first time. They had never seen it before. And I don't at all mean to say that television is the entire cause of this, but it certainly was a major one.
You mean it's because television reported the war that many people turned against it?
I think television was one of the major reasons people turned against the war. There were, of course, other sources of news, newspapers, magazines, and so on, which also were, for the first time in war, uncensored. But television was certainly the most graphic depiction of the war.
Didn't television possibly also lull people simply by the fact that the war was often presented rather attractively by attractive correspondents, and it was, while it was in people's living rooms and perhaps it involved them that way, didn't it perhaps tend also to disinvolve them in the way of being kind of like a movie, kind of like a John Wayne after all?
I don't think so. The war was not presented on television as an attractive, pleasing, sanitary enterprise. I can remember numerous nights when we had very unsettling, unattractive pictures of fighting, shooting, wounds, bodies. And no one in this country had ever seen that before. Your point is a good one, that it is conceivable that anything coming out of a television tube is seen to some extent, unconsciously perhaps, by the audience, as a part of this constant stream of entertainment that comes out of the tube. News programs have that problem to some extent. Just ahead of you on the screen may be an announcer with a lot of teeth selling toothpaste or something like that. And an audience is asked to change gears rather rapidly from superficial nonsense to material with some degree of seriousness. And that may have happened to some extent in the war, but I think after a while, when the real ugliness of it began to be shown on the screen, It had a profound effect. I think it is not, or should not be, the purpose of a television news program deliberately and calculatedly to influence public opinion in the sense of going on the air and saying to yourself, well, I'm going to tell people what they should think, and I'm going to push their thinking in this direction or that direction. We don't do that. But I'm sure there is some incidental effect of that kind when we say that this has happened in the war and that has happened in the war. I am sure it has some influence on the public's opinion. But in this case, and in many others, public opinion in this country is ignored. Washington pays very little or no attention to it. The majority of the American people, somewhere in the, I guess around 67 or 8, somewhere in there, I can't remember exactly now, majority of the American people turned against the war, thought it was a mistake, and thought we should not be in it. Well, that's public opinion. Nevertheless, it ran on for another 5 or 6 years. So, as I say, if television influences public opinion is then ignored. So we are accused of having all kinds of influence we don't really have. At first, it didn't really seem to be a real war. At first, we sent a few advisors there with orders to shoot only in self-defense, and it was, as best I can recall, it seemed to me to be a sort of foreign aid program with guns, which were not to be fired. And it didn't really impress me or affect me a great deal one way or the other. But as Lyndon Johnson gradually expanded it into a full-scale war, it did, and I was opposed to it from the time it seemed to me to be a war, a real war.
I'm not talking about how people may have criticized broadcasters or you personally for presenting it, but you were the anchor man or one half of the anchor team that would switch to Da Nang or Phu Bai or Con Thien or Saigon for a report, and I was just wondering if as your own feelings changed, it might have changed your tone, made you more skeptical, made your tone a little wryer.
Well, it's possible, but it's possible that did happen, that I became on the air more skeptical because I was more skeptical off the air. But to say now precisely what form this took is very hard, and I rather doubt I could do it. I did not preach against the war. On the air I didn't. Off the air I did, in speeches and so on. But if you're on the air as a correspondent, as a newsman, asking to be believed, asking to be taken seriously, asking people to accept that what you say is true, then you pretty much have to stick to what you know is true and can demonstrate to be true. To have a correspondent standing in Vietnam saying, gee, folks, I think this is a really lousy mess here. It's a disgrace and we ought to get out and so on. That may very well be how he feels, but that is not his job.
Why, if he's been there for a year or a year and a half, is that not his job to communicate?
Because that is not the service we undertake to give the American people. What we offer them is a factual, I don't say objective, but fair, factual, and as far as possible unemotional view of whatever it is we're covering, the war in this case. And if the correspondent wants to say, as I felt, and probably most of them felt, that it was an idiotic mess, then he can write a book, he can write a magazine article, he can make a speech, he can do anything he likes. But on a news program, I do not think it is appropriate. I didn't then, and I don't now.
why? It sounds like
Well,
you're giving
suppose,
television...
all right, now you're going to say that, suppose on the other hand we thought the war was just great, a holy patriotic exercise. So we chose correspondents to reflect that view and sent them all to Vietnam. And everyone came on waving a flag and saying this is the greatest thing that ever happened, that the American soldiers are here saving the world from these filthy communists. Would you like that? No, you would not. So what you're saying, what people say, is that they would like very much to have a reporter's subjective views so long as they agree with them. If we had sent a pack of right-wingers, militarists, hawks, to Vietnam and let them stand out on the battlefield and give their views, all of those who are critical of this way of working would just raise hell. And it's a blind spot on the part of most people. They say, oh yes, let's have analysis, opinion, let's have personal views, so long as they agree with them. We are obligated to tell the government's side as the government puts it out. We really have no choice in the matter. It is not a practical or feasible possibility for a news medium to be at, say, the Manila conference and to have Johnson's press secretary, whoever it was at the time, I've forgotten, come out with a statement from the President of the United States, and for us to say, well, that's nonsense, we're not even going to broadcast it. We can't do that. We cannot do that. On some kind of lofty ideological plane, you might entertain or dance around with such an idea, but as a working, practical reality, it is impossible. We cannot do it. And I would again make the point I've made before. If the president in this case were a popular president pursuing a popular policy, and we refused to do that, nobody would put up with it. So anyone who suggests anything like that has not thought it through. To say that we pass along what the government says does not necessarily mean that we endorse it, approve it, believe it, or like it, or have any other approving reaction. During the war, the reporters were extremely questioning of government pronouncements. And after some experience with it, I won't say we believed nothing they said, but we took almost nothing at face value. As for questioning Saigon's pronouncements, we questioned them so much we almost never paid any attention to them. As for questioning Hanoi's pronouncements, it's a kind of empty exercise because we didn't really have any access to Hanoi. We reported what they said if it seemed interesting or seemed important enough. But there was a questioning and critical attitude throughout.
Throughout?
Well, when I say throughout, I mean from the time it really became a war. Yes, throughout. When we used to get, in fact still get, all kinds of optimistic estimates of how much damage was being done to North Vietnam by the bombing. I must say we never took it all that seriously because all the other information we had was to the contrary, that the bombing was not effective, that the Air Force would like us to think it was effective because the Air Force is in the business of bombing. If you're in the hardware business, you want people to think well of hardware. If you're in the bombing business, you do whatever you can to promote it, and that's what they do. That doesn't mean we have to buy it. And generally, we didn't. It came to the point where they'd have a $50 million bomber dropping $3 million worth of bombs to blow up a $50 ox cart. And we were asked to believe on that basis that the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong were being seriously hurt. We knew they weren't. For years, Lyndon Johnson said we're bombing to cut off the flow of supplies to the south. They were never cut off at all. As far as we could tell, as far as any objective observer could tell, they moved as freely as they wanted to move them. It was totally ineffective. So we decoded, as you say, the Pentagon, White House announcements on the war by comparing them to what we knew to be the truth. And very often the match, there was a very poor match.
What about the body count?
The body count was a figure almost totally manufactured out of thin air by the military commanders on the scene. It even happened sometime they were told from Washington what size body count was wanted, and so they would then produce it. I, in any case, I obviously can't speak for everybody on television, but I never believed any of it, and said often, I didn't say it every time the body count came out because it would come to be repetitive and monotonous, but said often that these figures are far from accurate. And what they say is that the body count is this and that and this and that. We always were careful to say that it was their count. Now the problem is that I didn't believe their figures, but I could not produce any others. There's no way we could go and count the bodies. It's just a physical impossibility. And so while we did not believe what they were saying, we could not offer any contrary facts because they were unavailable to us.
What about the POWs, especially the return of the POWs recently, which we ourselves have been covering? But hasn't that been trumpeted up into a circus that may be unfair not only to the public but to the POWs themselves, because it imposes a terrific burden of heroism on them?
Well, I think the return of the POWs was a carefully arranged, stage-managed event, which may have been justified because they did suffer quite a lot. They were locked up for as long as 7 years and treated quite badly. But nevertheless, they were singled out by the White House to play the role of war heroes, whereas others who fought throughout the war and often came home badly wounded never got any attention at all. They were flown into Air Force bases quietly at night with no announcement. We never knew when they were coming nor where. Put away in veterans' hospitals where they still remain. This is very unrealistic and is not going to happen, but I have thought often that if all the wounded returning from a war had to be brought through the president's office on their way to a veterans' hospital where he could see them, it would probably be the end of wars because nobody could stand it. But instead we put them in hospitals and no one ever sees them.
Why haven't you said on the air what you just said about the wounded soldiers going through the president's office?
Because I never really thought about it in those terms until a few minutes ago. 2 or 3 times, I'm relying on memory, 2 or 3 times I believe we were told that South Vietnam and the U.S. were no longer, could not claim yet to be winning the war, but had stopped losing it. Well, I don't really know what that means, particularly when you remember that the war never had any clear objective anyway. I don't know what victory would have been. We could never have destroyed North Vietnam because we never intended to. We never intended to invade the North. No one ever had that in mind. Had we invaded the North, subdued it, and forced a surrender, then that would have been a victory. But we never intended to do that. So I don't know what victory would have been had we achieved it. To say that we are not losing the war would suggest that, well, it's come to be a kind of stalemate. I think it was a phrase somebody made up, intended to be pleasing or soothing or optimistic or hopeful, but a phrase that really said nothing and meant nothing. And as it turned out, as we know now, it didn't mean anything. We may have stopped losing somewhere back in those years, but we never started winning, because when we finally left, the North Vietnamese were about where they had been for years. They are now about where they were for years. It's very hard to say what has been accomplished there.
On television, you project an image of being wise and sometimes being above the events that are in the news. In the course of reporting the war, did anything shake you or surprise you? Did anything anger you or depress you? Or were you always above the news?
No, I was surprised, angered, and upset by a lot of it. By the My Lai massacre, by the Air Force officer who went into a little village after a South Vietnamese village after it had been destroyed and came out and said, well, we had to destroy it to save it. I thought that was one of the greatest commentaries on the Vietnam War, in the fewest words anyone ever made, even though it was unintentional. The widespread availability, in fact, the pushing of heroin at low prices was very distressing, because a lot of those guys are quite young, 19, 20 years old, not really old enough to know, in that sense, what they were doing to themselves. I was very distressed by what it was doing to this country, the social disruption here, the turning off of almost a whole generation of young people who probably will never again have any real respect for their leadership. I think that's a great tragedy. I think the effect of the war on this country was profoundly destructive. I think it left social wounds, scars, that if they ever heal, it will not be in our lifetime. I rather doubt it is possible yet to say how profound this damage has been. The economic damage we can measure, the inflation, the waste of money. We can count the lives that were lost. We can count the number of people who were wounded, permanently or otherwise. But the other damages, such as loss of public confidence in their leadership, loss of confidence in the political process, their disinclination to believe anything they are told by anybody, including us. People say the politicians are liars and so are the press. It will be a long, long time recovering from that, if in fact we ever recover. If we ever get back to the time when anyone and everyone can unashamedly be patriotic. You know, there was a time when that was a perfectly proper, attractive, pleasing emotion. Now we have enormous numbers of people in this country who are ashamed to display it because they have their feeling about the country and the system and the leadership have been profoundly changed for the worse. And that's a severe loss, which is, I don't know any way to measure it.